everybody, welcome to Catherine Sews. Have you ever seen these big, awesome books of sample fabrics that interior designers use and upholsterers, things like that? Companies are really quite happy to give these away because once it's out of style, they're just storing it and they don't really want to see it go to waste either. So in my experience, they've been really happy to give away lots of these. So if you're looking for something to make and sell on Etsy or sell for a fundraiser, it's pretty great to get your materials for free. Once they go out of season, there's not much use for them as they are, but with a couple of little tricks, we're going to be able to turn this huge collection of fabric into some really cool projects. So I'm excited to show you that. First thing I made of them was this beautiful tote bag, which is super useful and kind of cool. I'm going to show you how to take apart those books because that's a little bit of a struggle. But we're going to be able to take it all apart and use every bit of it. To get that whole book apart, you're going to need some cutting pliers. Oh, and I'm also going to use a butter knife to help wrestle this book open. With my butter knife, I'm going to pry this whole top part up. Good. And then pull off the two sides. Oof. Okay, so now you can see we are left with these 4 gigantic staples, and that's where the cutting pliers come in. You might also want safety glasses here. Yeah, safety glasses. Phew. Okay. Oh, there's also glue holding everything together. But the top layer is this clear plastic, which definitely holds a lot of possibilities for us. So then you can pull off the fabrics. So now this whole stack of fabrics is yours to play with, and there's so many beautiful ones in there. Some of them are kind of outdated for sure, but most of them are beautiful and they all coordinate together, which is so great. First of all, I'm going to show you how a great trick that I learned from another YouTuber on how to get the paper off. Honestly, sometimes I just leave it on for the extra stability. In fact, when I made this one, I didn't even take the paper off, and I kind of like that it's like got a little bit more stability because it's got some stiffness in there. I think it's totally fine, but this is such an awesome trick. I need to show you. To get this paper off, we need to have a hot iron. I want to have my iron on cotton setting. They all come with their fiber content labeled, so this one is 100% cotton, so I don't have to worry about melting my fabric. But if it was anything that was at all synthetic, I would just put a pressing cloth on top to protect this fabric while I work away the glue here. That hot iron with steam is just going to start melting the glue away. And then it just pulls right off like that. Isn't that nice? So I learned that trick from a YouTuber called Daisy Nick, and I'll link her video right here. Some of them are leaving bits of paper on, and you know what? I'm not even going to worry about that. That'll be fine. And some are just not coming off at all. And you know what? That's fine too. Okay, so this is what I've ended up with, and this is what you're going to need. I've got 3 pieces. There are 10 inches by 12 inches. 3 that are 10 inches by 6 inches. Those are going to make up the body of the bag. And then for my pocket, first of all, look at that. I got my logo digitized for my embroidery machine. So I'm super excited about that. So that's what I'm going to end up doing for the pocket, with one of the less beautiful fabrics as the lining of the pocket. The pocket piece is 7 inches by 6 inches. And then in the lining, it's just 5 inches by 6 inches. Good. I'm going to need a lighter for melting the ends of the straps. And this is polypropylene webbing and they're 20 inches long. A wax piece to draw with, your matching thread and bobbin, a ruler, and then about 1/2 meter of fabric to line the whole thing with. Pins and an iron. One thing I want to show you though is where the staples are. It's pretty big holes in the fabric. This one I couldn't get the paper off at all, but it's a good way to show you the staple holes. I think that would show up as a hole. So I'll be cutting off the tops of those. So I've just stacked them all on top of each other with the staple holes all here. And it's surprising this difference in the size. This one is from the smaller book, so it's my smallest piece. So I'm just gonna cut right there beside them all. There, just so that they're all even. And I'm getting rid of all the staple holes. Good, and now this one, I'll make the same as these. So I'm going to try for the pocket to just put these two pieces right side together and sew across the top. Okay, I'm immediately going to turn that and edge stitch it. My seam allowance is going to come out that way. The facing part, or the lining of the pocket, is going to come out over the seam allowance, and I'm just coming right back the opposite way without even having cut my threads yet. And I want to make sure that my seam allowance stays going toward the facing. This is understitching and it's going to keep everything flat. And this is why the lining is a little bit shorter. This was 6x7 and this was 6x5, because I didn't want the top edge of the pocket to look like that, right? With that lining showing. Don't love that too much. So it's going to roll in that way now. I think that'll be nicer. Okay, so now I'm going to put them together like this, and I'm going to sew and sew. I want to come around the corner, but I'm going to leave a gap in the middle to be able to turn that right side out. So making sure my bottom corners are lined up together. Okay, nice clean pivot at the corner. And I don't want to go too far because this is quite stiff, so I need a fairly big gap to be able to flip it right side out. So I'll just come to here and then hop right over and pivot. Before I flip it, I need to trim off the extra fabric around these corners. All of that seam allowance has to pack in there and it's too much. So I'm going to be cutting off around the corner. Definitely be careful not to cut your stitch, your last corner stitch, but you want to get as much off around there as you can. So now flipping this right side out, I kind of jam my thumb right into that corner and then push out that corner. On all four, jam my thumb right in there. Okay, huh? It's kind of cute. I love that. Okay, so I'm going to leave my scissors closed up and I'm going to push them into the corner there. Now I'm trying not to mash up that seam allowance into a ball. I want it to be flat, but I want it to be a nice pointy corner. I can't have the iron too high because these are synthetic fabrics and they will melt at the cotton setting. Now that gap, I'm just gonna leave that all tucked in, but I want it to look like a nice straight line, and I'm just gonna give that a press. Make sure this is looking straight. Okay, that'll do for the pocket. I'm gonna put a top stitch across there. I'm gonna have the edge right here, which is at the 20 line, which is, or 3/4 of an inch. And it's quite thick, so I'm going slowly to make sure I don't break a needle. And slow again. Good. So I'm going to go right sides together. I'm going to be sewing these all together here. And I'm just going to chain right into the next one. and right into the next one. See how much paper is left on this one? I just gave up after a while. I can cut the chain apart and then flip them and press them from the right side as well. Okay, so now on this piece I want it centered, not too close to the bottom, because we're going to be boxing the corners at the bottom, so you know this side kind of wraps around and becomes the bottom of the bag. So I think about there is good, and centered here. Good. Good, so about 5 pins around. I'm just going to sew those 3 sides now. Then while I'm at the machine, I'm going to be putting the other panels on, right sides together. Sew that side, flip it out, and sew this side. So there we go. When I'm sewing on a pocket, I like to sew nice and close to the edge. Okay, so that'll do for the pocket, and then I'm going to put these 2 together. Now I want to be able to match up that seam. I'm going to stab the pin through the seam on this side and make sure it comes out of the seam on that side, back into that seam, and back out of that seam. So those are just nailed together. And I'll do that on this side as well. So you're kind of weaving the pin in through all the layers. But then when I get to the seam, I just want to look underneath and make sure the seam allowance is staying open the way I pressed it. Otherwise it's going to make a bit of a lump there. My needle's not going to love this punching through this paper. I'll definitely have to replace the needle after this project. Back at the iron and just pressing all these seams open now. And then press from the right side. So this big quilted together piece now is the body of the bag. And now that we've got it sewn together, I can measure exactly how tall and how wide this is to be able to cut the lining piece. I'm going to snip and tear off the selvage. I never like to use the selvage because it's woven more tightly and makes your seam look puckery. So down one edge now, just to measure like that, a tear there. And I know this fabric is just a little bit wider than my bag, so I'm just going to tear right across. To get the proper length now, I'm just comparing those, and I need it to be right there. So good long snip, tear across. I've just folded my piece in half, and I'm going to be able to just match up those top corners and sew down this side and pivot and come across the bottom. So I'm going to match up my top corners of the lining, and on the side seam of the lining I have to leave a gap to turn the whole bag right side out later. A little back tack there, and then hop over at a few inches, at least the width of your hand. And then we can pivot. We could also leave the gap in the bottom here, or the side, doesn't really matter, as long as you've got a gap on the inside somewhere. I'm going to put the lining bag right over the pointy end of the ironing board so that I can press this seam open and flat. I can't really do the same thing on this one because, well, I can come down there, but I can't pivot and come across the bottom because we're going to be refolding this to get that pocket in the center, not on the side like this. So I'm going to come down and come back to the iron. So once again, I want to nail those seams together. Third seam now has to get pressed open and flat. Now for the bottom edge of the bag, I need to find the center of this side and match the center here with the seam there. I could either fold it in half or I could measure
And that's nice. I've got exactly 9 inches. So at 4.5 inches there, that's the point that I want to match up with that seam. So that's nicely centered. Now I'll be able to just sew across there, and then we'll box the corners. Checking those seam allowances underneath. Make sure they stay how you pressed them. So what I mean, this has to stay open. Don't let that seam allowance fold over. Okay, so for boxing the corners, it's probably easiest to show you on the lining, because what we're going to try to do is get this seam laying right on top of that seam. And we want this flat. Don't let any extra folds happen in here. That has to stay nicely flattened out like that. Let's do 1.5 inches or 4 centimeters from the point. I'm going to put a pin right there, and I'm going to sew a line that's perpendicular to this seam, sewing right across there. This one I'm going to press a bit of a crease there, just so I know I've got my triangle lined up right, because the seam does not continue here. So when I open up this seam, I want that to be laying right on top of that crease. Same idea on the bag. So what we're doing is basically you're grabbing the front and back and pulling those, the front and back, away from each other to get this seam right in the middle of your triangle. The triangle is even on both sides, yeah? So there's kind of a crease there. That looks even, nice and flat. That triangle that we pinned, make sure it goes in nice and flat on the back, no extra folds. The pin is where we want to be sewing perpendicular to this seam. Make sure the seam allowance stays open on the back so that it's nice and smooth. Come in for that pin perpendicular to this seam.
So I've got both bags sewn and they're both still inside out. I'm going to leave the lining one inside out, but I'm going to take the outside bag and turn it right side up. Good. So that's looking kind of cool. So now we're ready to put the straps on. This polypropylene webbing, it frays so much. If I just pulled that thread, I could run around my whole house and I'd have nothing left here. Okay, so I've got my little lighter. Now you can go do this beside a sink. I just have a little bowl of water in here, just in case things get out of control, but it's pretty easy. So I'm gonna take all 4 ends of my polypropylene webbing and I'm gonna just melt those threads. Just melt it all in there. Be careful anytime you're using a flame, and also the ends are hot. Obviously I just melted them, so they're hot right now. Just give them a second to cool.
For placing the straps, I found the middle of this center panel and I pinned it to the center back seam there so that this is all centered, right? Then I'm going to take one of my polypropylene straps that I've melted the ends and make sure it's not twisted, and then it goes hanging down like that, which I know seems inside out and backwards, but that's often how we sew. And I'm going to pin that just to the raw edge there and the seam over here, and I'll do the same on the back, right even with the other one. I'll just pin it there and here. Now of course that's a point of tension when you're using this bag, so I'm going to sew back and forth across there a few times with a nice strong back tack, and then we'll put the lining on. Just back tacking those straps on. So now this part might seem confusing, but trust me, this is how it works. So this bag stays facing right side out. The lining is inside out. The lining has one side seam, that's it. So I want to find where the other side is and make a little snip there. But mainly what I want is the centers. So I'm going to bring my seam line over to that little snip, and then folding it in half, I'll make a little notch here at the center front and center back. And now I've got my centers marked. This bag stays right side out and it goes inside the lining, with the lining being inside out, with the strap all tucked in, and that center notch is going to go to the center of the bag there. Pin together, tuck the strap in on this side, and it's that center back seam of the bag that's going to go to my center back notch here. And when I give that a tug, that fits all together nicely. So just 4 pins around the top should do it. If you want more pins, you certainly can. And then I'm going to sew all the way around this circle. And when I feel a strap there, I think I'll do another set of back tacks. Good, and now remember that gap we left on the side, or maybe you left it on the bottom, either way is fine. Now you're gonna pull the whole bag out from that gap. Awesome. Now before I shove the lining in, I like to press it around the top here, and I can feel that the seam allowance is coming toward the lining, and that's what I want. Now that we're at the iron, let me warn you, when I was making this one, on my final press, and I was all done, I took it to the iron, and look what I did. I totally melted the strap, so I had to unpick it and replace that strap. So while you're at the iron, just be careful. I do want it on a high setting because I want to be able to get a nice press at the top here, but just be careful not to press your straps and melt them. Let's get the strap going toward the main bag. I can feel underneath that the seam allowance is coming down into the lining. That's what we want. It's like under pressing, where we're pressing a facing or the lining to the inside, and that'll keep it from rolling out. Now I'm going to push the whole lining inside the bag and get a nice edge at the top. You could even put a pressing cloth right over the straps here so that you don't have a disaster like I did. So now I'm going to go back to the machine and sew once right at the edge, and then once again at the inch or 2.5 centimeter line. And then the very last thing, once I'm happy with the bag and everything's done, I'll just find that gap and just pull the ends of the gap tight so the edges come together and sew nice and close to those 2 edges. And then we're done. So on an important top stitch like this that's really going to show, I try to do very small back tacks. Organize as you go, and just make sure that that lining just turns like hair inside. We don't want to see the lining poking out. See how it wants to poke out there? Just roll that to the inside. Now I'm getting my edge up against the inch or 2.5 centimeter line. And I'm feeling with 2 fingers that there's no extra folds happening inside here. And lining back up right where I started. Okay. And here's my gap, and I'm just going to sew nice and close to the edge there.
So we are done. There's 2 beautiful bags basically for free, right? And so if you're trying to build a business on Etsy, or you're trying to do a fundraiser, pretty great that you can get free materials that you can turn into something really beautiful. And you know what's nice is that each one of the tote bags that you make are going to be completely different. They're each going to be unique. So I hope you enjoyed that. I hope you learned something. And if you did learn something, you know what you got to do? You got to hit that subscribe button. My name is Catherine, and I can't wait to sew with you again. See you next time.